All right, welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into exactly how organizations actually survive the unpredictable seas of business using strategic controls. We spent all this time formulating the absolute perfect strategy, right? But what happens when the ink dries and the real work begins? Well, that is exactly what we're going to unpack today. Because let's face it, you can craft the most brilliant comprehensive plan in the boardroom, but reality is just packed with unexpected shifts. Once you're actually implementing that plan, you're instantly dealing with a totally dynamic, often ambiguous environment. So the real trick is figuring out how to adapt without losing your way. You literally can't just blindly follow a blueprint when the ground underneath you is constantly shifting.
To figure this all out, here's our agenda for today. First, steering the strategic ship. Second, the 4 strategic controls. Third, enter strategic surveillance. Fourth, surveillance versus other controls. And finally, keeping your radar active.
Okay, let's jump right into Section 1, steering the strategic ship, and look at the fundamental role of strategic control.
I absolutely love this metaphor from Pearson Robinson. They say that strategic control is essentially the steering control of a ship. It just perfectly illustrates how management has to continuously sense their environment to guide the firm toward its long-term destination. Just like a ship's steering keeps it stable on its chosen course despite shifting winds or crazy ocean currents, your strategic control system acts as that exact steering mechanism. It keeps you oriented toward those big, overarching goals.
So rather than waiting around and just looking at the final results years down the line, when it's way too late to actually fix anything, strategic control is your active, ongoing process. It's constantly evaluating if your chosen strategy needs maybe just a few minor tweaks or perhaps a complete reformulation. It's how you handle the unknown while your strategy is actively unfolding in real time.
Now, take a look at the vast, complex environments we have to navigate here. On the left side, you've got these massive external forces, things like the climate, the economy, legal shifts, and crazy technological changes. These are factors totally outside your short-term control. Then, on the right, you have your internal environment, your organizational culture, your structure, your physical assets. Your strategic controls absolutely must actively monitor all of this to keep your ship upright. All right, moving right along to Section 2, the 4 strategic controls, which is essentially your navigational toolkit. To keep everything stable, management basically relies on these 4 distinct types of strategic controls. We've got premise control, implementation control, special alert control, and strategic surveillance. Each one serves a very specific purpose in checking if your strategy is still viable. But for the rest of this explainer, we're really going to zero in on that last one, strategic surveillance, because honestly, it's arguably the most dynamic tool in the entire box.
Which brings us to Section 3, enter strategic surveillance. Think of this as your organization's 360-degree radar. The core mantra here is simple: expect the unexpected. While your other controls are out there looking for specific, planned-for data points, strategic surveillance exists specifically to uncover relevant but completely unanticipated information. It's kind of this humbling acknowledgement that no matter how genius your planning is, there is simply no way you can predict every single thing lurking beneath the surface.
Think of it as generalized environmental scanning that literally never turns off. It doesn't just track one specific metric or variable. Instead, it's a continuous, wide sweep across your entire industry, actively looking for anything that could threaten the course of your firm's strategy. And that applies both inside your company walls and out there in the broader marketplace.
Now, you might be wondering, where does this surveillance information actually come from? I mean, if it's not some formal, scheduled quarterly report, how does this generalized, unexpected data actually make its way to the decision makers during their normal day-to-day operations?
Well, the sources are quite literally everywhere. It completely relies on maintaining an active awareness during, frankly, mundane activities. We're talking about reading trade magazines, going to industry conferences, and this is a huge one, everyday business conversations at the coffee machine. Setting up a simple information scanning system can actually preserve so much of this vital intel that would otherwise just get lost in the day-to-day shuffle.
Okay, Section 4, surveillance versus other controls. Knowing your instruments is absolutely critical here because it is super easy to get these mixed up. Let's break them down.
First off, let's contrast it with special alert control. Remember how surveillance is that continuous, humming radar always running in the background? Well, a special alert control is the blaring emergency alarm that sounds during sudden crises. We're talking natural disasters, industrial accidents, or a sudden massive collapse in share prices.
A special alert demands an immediate, drop-everything reassessment, whereas surveillance is your ongoing broad-based vigilance.
Then we have premise control. Premise control systematically checks the specific initial assumptions you made during your strategy planning. For example, if you assumed interest rates would stay low, premise control monitors those interest rates. Surveillance, on the other hand, it's watching the unknowns. It's actively looking for the blind spots that fall entirely outside those initial premises.
And taking a step back, you've got to remember that all of these strategic controls are fundamentally different from operational control. Operational control really only asks if task-level schedules are being met or if resources are being used properly on a day-to-day basis. Strategic control asks a much bigger, existential question. Are we even doing the right things in the first place? And do we need to reformulate our overarching strategy entirely?
Which leads us nicely into Section 5, keeping your radar active. Because as you can imagine, the danger of flying blind is pretty catastrophic.
A radar is really only useful if someone is actually watching the screen and interpreting the blips, right? Take your internal surveillance, for example. It needs to be sharp enough to detect operational friction. Think about the classic corporate rivalries, like marketing and engineering just constantly butting heads, or the sales group and the credit department being at odds. If management isn't paying attention, that kind of internal friction can quietly but completely derail a massive strategy.
So integrating continuous surveillance effectively bridges the gap between your well-crafted plans and actual reality. It allows your organization to dynamically handle ambiguous environments and proactively adapt your master blueprint to shifting realities. Most importantly, doing this prevents strategic drift. And strategic drift, where you're just stubbornly clinging to a master plan that no longer matches the current environment, is exactly what we want to avoid.
As we wrap up this explainer, I really want you to ask yourself, is your organization's radar actually turned on, or are you just flying blind? Are you actively looking out for the unexpected, or are you clinging to a map that doesn't match the territory anymore? Remember, strategy is a ship that requires constant, vigilant steering. Thanks so much for joining me today, and hey, keep that radar active.